Republicans have challenged that. They want the state to simply throw away defective mail-in ballots and disallow any provisional ballot that a voter would cast. Their theory is that the voter already cast a ballot by mail, even though it was rejected for being defective and thrown in the trash. So they say you shouldn't be allowed to vote provisionally if you screw up your original ballot. Welcome to Law and Chaos. We're just a few days out from the election, and Trump's goons are already screaming fraud. Lara Trump got control of the DOJ and bragged that they filed lawsuits in 81 states. Not sure about that math. And with polling tight, we're all wondering how Trump will try to steal it this time. So today, we'll give you our predictions on how this is all going to go down. And if you've got nightmares about hanging chads in the Supreme Court, maybe pour yourself a stiff one right about now. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get after it. Happy Friday, Chaos Monkeys. I'm Liz Dye. With me, as always, is Andrew Torres. Andrew, how are you?
I'm good, Liz. How are you doing?
I mean, I wouldn't say this was like the most fun one to research and write.
we've got some good news and some, positive signs for optimism and also some terrifying thoughts. But,
Yeah, it is what it is. All right. Today, we are going to spend the entire hour talking about the election, obviously. Specifically, we're going to give kind of an overview of the cases and talk about what we think is going to happen going forward. And not to bury the lead here, we think that if Harris is narrowly ahead, particularly if she is under like 290 electoral votes, Trump and the Republicans are going to try and recreate a Bush v. Gore scenario where they challenge just enough Harris votes to get themselves ahead in the counting. And then they race to the legislature or the state court or most likely the Supreme Court in hopes of stealing it.
Yeah, and if that seems far-fetched, remember in 2020, the issue for Attorney General Bill Barr when Donald Trump tried to enlist his aid in stealing the states wasn't that he objected to using the Department of Justice to interfere with state election results. It was that Biden was ahead in so many states that it would have been impossible. And then, instead of doing anything to stop what he saw coming down the pike, Barr negotiated his departure in such a way as to avoid getting fired by tweet. Like, his priority was not ensuring a peaceful and, more to the point, lawful transition of power. Barr's priority was saving his own skin. And even now, he's out there saying he's going to vote for Trump, right? And that's in part because Barr is a proto-fascist, but in part because he started a law firm with other Trump administration alumni, quote, grown-ups like Pat Cipollone and Pat Philbin from the White House counsel's office. And, they've got to keep sweet with the GOP and not get themselves blacklisted in MAGA world. It's gross.
Yeah, he's a villain. So let's spend a couple minutes reminding ourselves what went down 4 years ago, since it informs our understanding going forward. First, let's talk about what was different 4 years ago. Of course, the biggest thing is COVID, right? Republicans turned a public health crisis into a culture war issue 4 years ago. And so they fought every common sense measure, which would have made it easier and safer for people to vote, in a pandemic. So the effect of that was twofold. It meant that Democrats were several times more likely to vote absentee, particularly by mail, while Republicans were more likely to vote in person on Election Day. And if you think about it, that kind of sorting was its own gerrymander, right? Republicans were very hot to challenge absentee ballots because, as a subset, those absentee ballots and early votes were like 70% Democratic. And, conversely, they had very little incentive to challenge in-person votes.
Yeah, in fact, they had incentive to lie about in-person voting in states where they lost, which they did. Remember Sharpiegate? That was the lie about election officials having Arizona voters in Republican precincts mark their ballots with Sharpies, which would then cause the machine to reject them. And that was, I have to stress, completely false. But it was cited in multiple lawsuits and, of course, presidential tweets.
Yeah. And look, it's a bit of a rabbit trail, but let's bear down on the effect of COVID on the GOP lies, because so-called sane Republicans today won't usually repeat conspiracy theories about like fraud and rampant voting by undocumented immigrants in 2020. What they say, what J.D. Vance said when he was pressed, is that there were illegal changes to voting procedures, and that invalidated the result, possibly by making it easier for, undocumented immigrants to cast ballots, whatever. But let's drill down on what they meant by that. What they meant was courts and secretaries of state made it too easy to vote, and they think that's unfair. Like Republicans who have backed away from the, Chinese space laser bullshit are literally saying the election in 2020 was illegitimate because too many people got to vote by absentee ballot, and there was voter registration in the park, and ballots got accepted a few days late so long as they were postmarked by election day. And all these legitimate votes should have been tossed out because it was too easy for voters to cast a ballot.
That's exactly right. And I want to emphasize what you're saying there, Liz, because in 2020, the Center for Tech and Civic Life, which is a nonprofit sponsored by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, offered grants to government agencies that wanted to make it easier to vote. And because only Democrats believe in expanding the franchise, the municipalities who applied for these grants were pretty much in Democratic cities. That wasn't some kind of globalist conspiracy to steal the election and make us eat bugs. And it wasn't billionaires buying the vote, right? Unlike now, where Elon Musk is literally giving money away in Pennsylvania and stumping for Trump and hopping around on stage in a belly shirt and whatever. Put a pin in that asshole for a second. But Mark Zuckerberg's philanthropic grants to improve voting access and technology were aimed at making it easier for all citizens to vote. And that is literally the basis for the so-called respectable Republicans. You call them the sane Republicans. I would quibble with that, saying that the 2020 election was unfair. That and the fact that the tech platforms suppressed the Hunter Biden stolen laptop for, 24 hours in early October. That's it. That's their list of grievances.
Right. But this time around, none of that's happening. We are not in a national emergency. The election is going down in a more or less orderly fashion thus far. And the billionaires are all more or less backing Trump. I mean, there was this crazy story in the Times last week about billionaires all meeting up in Palm Beach and basically goading Musk into running point on this plot to get Trump elected. We do not have time for it. We will link to it in the show notes. Anyway, this year, you have Musk suppressing the leaked J.D. Vance documents. It's the most amazing hypocrisy. And Zuckerberg got over whatever stirrings of civic duty he ever felt, if any. And he did not subsidize voter outreach this cycle. So this is more a normal election to the extent that any election since 2000 has been normal. The second big difference between now and 2020 is that Democrats control the White House. So the plan to have Pence reject the swing state ballots in his, role as president of the Senate, well, that's DOA, right? Because now Harris is president of the Senate, and she's, clearly not going to go along with that plot.
Yeah, and add to that Bill Barr or Jeff Clark or whoever is not in charge of the Justice Department is not in charge of the Justice Department. So instead of the DOJ laundering Rudy Giuliani's gin farts about Ukraine and investigating bogus election fraud claims, instead the Civil Rights Division is suing Virginia and Alabama to stop them from purging voter rolls on the eve of the election, because that violates the National Voter Registration Act's ban on systemic purges within 90 days of the vote. And just as an aside here, the RNC has filed suits in multiple states trying to force states to, quote, clean their voter rolls. As if lists of registered voters are definitionally dirty. We have written about this on the site at lawandchaospod.com. But essentially, these lawsuits are not about winning. They are a cheap way to play to their base and reinforce the narrative that there are hundreds of thousands of illegal voters and have that seep into the public consciousness. There was a case decided this week in Michigan where the RNC pointed to the number of inactive voters on the rolls as evidence that the Secretary of State wasn't properly maintaining the rolls, right? As if, you skip one election and they have to purge your name like it's, Russia in 1942, right? Meanwhile, the RNC literally pulled that number about inactive voters from the Secretary of State's own filings, since those are the people in the process to be removed. If you haven't voted in 2 successive presidential elections, they send you a postcard that says, hey, looks like maybe you don't live here anymore. Please respond or we're going to cancel your voter registration. So definitionally, yes, she was in fact removing them as required by law. And, while we're on a little tangent, you may have heard Republicans making the claim today, right now, that there are more registered voters than people in Michigan. And let's nip that lie in the bud, shall we?
Yeah, that's what they've been saying for years.
Yeah, but this time the RNC actually argued this in federal court in Michigan recently, and Judge Jane Beckering was having none of it. Here's what she said. Plaintiffs' allegations are based entirely on a comparison of census survey data to the total, not active, number of records in Michigan's qualified voter file, leading plaintiffs to inaccurately conclude that there are more registered voters than the voting age population in these counties. So, just to parse that out, the way that this particular lie gets constructed is the RNC takes the census data, figures out how many people in a particular county are old enough to vote, and then looks at the voter rolls and says, see, there's more registrations than voters, which doesn't make sense since, for one thing, the census was in 2020, and this is 2024, so there are 4 years of new voters that get added to the rolls over that time period, 14-year-olds who are now 18. And as the judge points out, if you add in inactive voters who are flagged for removal in that list of supposedly active voters, you're making a totally bogus comparison. But if the purpose of your dumb lawsuit was to launder a lie, congratulations, point taken. Anyway, to circle back, the fact that the Department of Justice is not under Trump's control is one way that this election will be different from 2020. And also, there have been reforms to the Electoral Count Act. We're going to talk about that near the end of the show. But to be clear, we think that it is much more likely that this election will look like 2000 than like 2020. That is, we expect that the important post-election litigation will involve Republicans shouting, count every vote, until the second that they're ahead, at which point they'll yell, stop the count, and more to the point, they will sue for an injunction demanding that officials stop the count, which is how you wind up with President George W. Bush inaugurated because he managed to get himself 537 votes ahead in Florida and convince the Supreme Court to dive in and ensure that not a single additional vote was tabulated, more or less. We'll get into it.
Right. So with that as backdrop, let's talk about the pre-election cases. And I should say that some of the cases which we're characterizing as post-election cases are in fact already filed. They're essentially placeholders since they will not be resolved until after the election. But right now, we have a bunch of cases trying to essentially block access to the ballot box. That includes, obviously, lawsuits seeking to get rid of ballot drop boxes. In fact, I think one of those ballot drop boxes was set on fire today. And they are becoming the locus of a lot of threats of vigilante violence. So good job, America. The lawsuits also include efforts to ensure that the deadline to register votes wasn't extended in places like North Carolina that were hit by hurricanes, which is, it's Republicans filing those lawsuits. That's basically an admission that they don't want people to vote. But Pennsylvania is kind of the ground zero for these lawsuits, in part because it's obviously important electorally, but also because its procedures for absentee ballots are so Byzantine. Like there's an outer envelope and an inner security envelope, and you have to date and sign the inner envelope and write down your star sign and the date of your last period and pat your head and rub your tummy. And I don't know what else. But if you screw any of those things up, they don't count your ballot, or at least, I don't know, the GOP is deeply invested in getting those ballots tossed if you don't pronounce every word of the magical incantation. And the Republicans file a lot of lawsuits seeking to ensure that if you do screw up your ballot, you don't get to fix it and you don't get to, vote in person provisionally.
Yet it really does give the game away when you file a lawsuit saying this totally legitimate voter who lived her whole life in like Allentown messed up her mail-in ballot, and we want to make sure that county officials don't tell her that or give her a chance to fix it or let her vote in person on election day. Like, that, you howl about illegal votes or whatever, but like, there's no way to dress that up as anything other than denying voters the right to vote. But those suits trying to block access to the ballot box will largely be resolved by Election Day. And for reasons that we'll get to in a little bit, I think the thing to watch here is whether any court instructs election officials in any of the 7 swing states to segregate any block of votes, right, such as mail-in, overseas, challenge voters, or whatever, so that they can become an issue after the election. And now, or after this ad break, if you're not a subscriber, over at patreon.com/lawncastpod or at lawncastpod.com, we will talk about post-election litigation.
Okay, so we think about the post-election litigation as falling into 3 basic buckets: the crazy bucket, the chaos bucket, and the point-shaping bucket. So stick with me, guys. I'm going somewhere. So let's start with the crazy because that's probably the least important. These are the lawsuits based on spurious allegations of fraud. This is your Kraken nonsense, or I don't know, maybe this cycle it'll be your Elon Musk nonsense. Because he's encouraging ex-Twitter users to do your own research and report any election irregularities on the platform. And look, it's mostly people being like, my mama said the machines was flipping votes in East Ass Crack, like deep in some red state where nobody would bother to screw with the vote. Whatever.
Counterpoint, Mesa County, Colorado. Actually, we wrote that in the script, and damn if 5 minutes before we went to air, the Colorado Secretary of State didn't announce that someone of unspecified party affiliation tried to submit a set of fraudulent absentee ballots and got caught because the signatures didn't match the ones on file. I'm going to maybe get out in front of my skis here and say that this is going to wind up being some kind of wacko Republican stunt trying to prove that elections can be stolen by submitting fraudulent ballots. Remember, Mesa County is where Tina Peters damaged the Dominion voting machines trying to prove that the Dominion voting machines were damaged and there was therefore rampant fraud, right?
Right. I mean, Tina Peters gets convicted. And then a month later in this office, like in a highly Republican district that nobody would, think of trying to steal, someone sends in fraudulent ballots trying to possibly prove that there was voter fraud going on. Like, yeah, that one reeks to high heaven. But all right, we will wait and see. The Secretary of State, Jenna Griswold, said she cannot, release any further information, including what the votes on those ballots were. But speaking of people doing their own research and winding up on the ass end of reality and perhaps the law, yesterday, this truly repellent Republican activist named Cliff Maloney posted what he thought was a big old gotcha on Elon's health site. Maloney is running some door-knocking operation called the Pennsylvania Chase. In fact, he sells himself as a GOTV expert. But judging by what happened this week, I'm not really sure about that one. So on Tuesday, Maloney tweets, breaking, a member of the PA Chase discovered an address in Erie, PA today where 53 voters are registered. Turns out it's the Benedictine Sisters of Erie and no one lives there. We knocked on the door because a Republican mail-in ballot is unreturned. Our attorneys are reviewing this one right now. We will not let the Dems count on illegal votes.
Look, man,
okay.
I'm an atheist and even I know this one is not going to end well.
Wait for it. Going on. Now the commies are coming in claiming that nuns live there. Or you idiot, just Google it. Wrong. Our team leader spoke to the one person there and they claim no one lives here. Hello? All right.
Wait, the one person they say lives there said that no people live there? Oh, I'm sorry.
Doesn't
Keep
matter.
going.
Look, we Googled it and it turns out that the Benedictine Sisters of Erie maintain an extremely robust presence both online at eriebenedictines.org and offline doing missionary work in the community. In fact, one of them just interviewed Liz Cheney last week, which is what you would have found if you Googled Benedictine Sisters of Erie. So anyway, the sisters put out a press statement reading Maloney for filth. And the prioress, Sister Stephanie Schmidt, said, quote, we want to call Cliff Maloney to account for his blatantly false post that accuses our sisters of fraud. We do live at Mount St. Benedict Monastery, and a simple web search would alert him to our active presence in a number of ministries in Erie. We also want to alert those who subscribe to X and other social media platforms to be vigilant and seek additional information before accepting these posts as truth. Sing it, sister. A free republic depends on free and fair elections. It depends equally on a discerning and conscientious citizenry who do not unquestioningly accept the word of anyone who has a social media platform. Burn. And then she gave a tour to some nice reporters from the Washington Post who took a picture of the nuns at chapel in the place where they live, after which Maloney backed down and said he was real sorry about the misunderstanding.
Oh, did he really now?
No. He put out a long-ass tweet saying, if the 53 people registered at this address are legal voters, then I encourage them to participate in their right to vote. Right now, we've got our team continuing to analyze the situation. Because the nuns haven't adequately proved to him that they exist yet. So that's ridiculous. Anyway, my point is, we will have litigation based on just this kind of horse shit. And for reasons I laid out in the written post yesterday, I suspect it will get dealt with pretty quickly.
Right, because part of what happened in 2020 was that those garbage cases contesting the certification of the vote in swing states based on nonsense claims dragged on for a long time. I think judges were blindsided, right? Sidney Powell and the rest of her dingus lawyers got sanctioned because they multiplied the proceedings. That is, they said, this is an emergency because we have to get relief before the Electoral College meets on December 14th. That was the date in 2020. This year it's the 17th, but again, mid-December. And then after the 14th, they didn't go away, despite the fact that they'd admitted that their case was moot. They just kept going even into January. They also got sanctioned for filing a bunch of garbage affidavits on the docket from dipshit Magoo and Terpsichore and Spider saying, he saw a suspiciously cheerful couple hand something to the UPS man and he thinks it was maybe a Chinese bamboo ballot or whatever. And you can bet your bottom dollar that this go round, it'll be the nuns in Erie or whatever featuring in those lawsuits demanding that the certification be enjoined because, fraud, fishy hates everything.
Hey-o. Hey, Papa Fishy.
And last time, the Trump campaign pointed to that ongoing litigation as itself being proof to hoodwink some of the fake electors into signing their fake electoral certificates, right? Like, it's pretty clear in Pennsylvania where they got contingent language added in, and maybe in Georgia that they really thought they might have been contingent electors, right? Like, in case one of these court cases went through and overturned Biden's victory. But you wrote, Liz, and I agree with you, that courts are administratively streamlining procedures in advance in 2024 for these kinds of election cases, right? They're shortening deadlines. They are prioritizing them for immediate review. They are dedicating resources to handling them. And I think the judiciary writ large, both state and federal, felt like Trump and his minions used it to spread lies about election fraud and make it look like there was some there when it was all just nonsense. And they don't want to see that happen again. So in addition to that, you alluded to this earlier. In 2022, Congress passed the Electoral Count Reform Act. We're going to come back to that one at the end, but just note here that the law provides for an immediate hearing on issues relating to the certification of electors that implicate state law. Those cases will now get a hearing before a 3-judge panel consisting of 1 district court judge and 2 circuit court judges in the federal district of the state capital, and then immediately appealable to the Supreme Court. So, bottom line, courts are much better prepared this time, and we expect that the garbage suits based on silly statistical analysis or Sharpies or whatever will get handled in short order. And that takes us from crazy to the chaos suits.
All right, time for chaos. But first, time for a couple of ads, unless you're a subscriber, in which case, not for you, baby. Okay, we've talked about the crazy suits. Let's now talk about the chaos suits. I suppose we should say that these aren't entirely rigid categories. We are characterizing the chaos lawsuits as litigation based in objective reality, but more or less that it just existing to gum up the work. So, for instance, in 2020, the Trump campaign filed a bunch of lawsuits saying that signature verification wasn't rigorous enough and the ballots should be reevaluated in Georgia and I think Nevada to find which ones are fraudulent and throw them out. The basis of this argument was that there was no signature verification going on in Georgia and Nevada, which was completely false and bullshit. But the signatures themselves, those were real, right? And Trump also filed suits demanding recount after recount, and he mostly lost, but he did succeed in chewing a whole lot of clock doing it.
Right. Speaking of recounts, so usually if the candidates are within like half a point, you get a state-funded mandatory recount. It does vary state by state, but that's the typical rule. Usually, if it's between half a point and a point, then it's an optional recount if the candidate wants to pay for it. Trump did that, but kept suing for additional recounts in big blue counties where there were a lot of Democratic votes.
Some coincidence, right?
Yeah.
Also, the Trump campaign filed a bunch of lawsuits seeking to invalidate whole tranches of votes on the theory that something about the way they were handled after they were counted invalidated them. That's like they said the chain of custody was wrong, and so the votes should be tossed, or Republican observers weren't in the room during the count, so the votes should be tossed, or the machine wasn't adequately tested beforehand, and the results are presumptively invalid. Like, This is the kind of lawsuit that was most offensive to me, since the premise is that a voter could cast a legitimate ballot only to have it invalidated by some error at the clerk's office, but like times 10,000, which is why the courts universally rejected all of those claims. And thanks to the expedited processing this time around, I think they're going to do the same thing again. And in fact, they're going to do it faster. But in 2020, we also saw a handful of local election officials refusing to certify the ballot until ordered to by a court or threatened with lawsuits. Trump and former RNC chair Ronna Romney McDaniels were actually recorded pressuring officials in Wayne County, Michigan, not to certify the count in Detroit, which would have flipped the state. In the end, after the threats of litigation, those officials did vote to certify. But certification refusal is likely to be a bigger problem this cycle and potentially much bigger, which is why we're sticking it in the chaos bucket here. Like, this probably will not work. It will, however, cause chaos if the state has a deadline to certify the vote and enough state officials refuse to do their jobs.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Remember, on the show, we have talked about lawsuits in Georgia over changes to the rules that would have instructed local officials to, do their own research before certifying the vote. That was pretty obviously a pretext to allow those local officials, where they're sympathetic to Trump, to point to tiny discrepancies in the count to draw the entire election into suspicion. In reality, there are always discrepancies, right? There's human error, there's machine error, some ballot gets damaged or falls behind the machine or whatever, right? In Georgia, the state election board wanted to impose an obligation on every local election official to do a hand count of the ballots, with 3 officials, including the poll manager who's supposed to be supervising the tabulation, each doing a separate count and then comparing them. And if they didn't match down to the exact number or match with the machine count, then they had to keep looking until I kind of trailed off at that point. I don't know, something. Whatever, that law got enjoined. But the point is that election deniers are seeking to inject chaos into the process by encouraging local officials to disobey the law. And it is disobeying the law. The certification process is ministerial, not discretionary, right? This is exactly like saying that Mike Pence could use his own discretion about which electoral votes to count. No, he couldn't. No, you don't. Local election officials have a responsibility to oversee the elections in accordance with the law, count the votes in accordance with the law, and then certify and submit the results of their count. End of. But a bunch of red-pilled loons got themselves elected and appointed to these positions, and it's clear that they're going to try and throw sand in the gears any way they can if they're losing. And when they do, they're going to get sued. And again, Liz, as you pointed out, all of this takes time, and the clock is ticking to the certification deadline.
Right. I think it's important to say that the GOP will probably come up with like 5 different kinds of chaos suits we haven't thought of yet. Because, before 2020, who would think that, they would do this, that they would refuse to certify? The point of these lawsuits is mostly to delay the inevitable and buy time for the GOP to spread a narrative that there's widespread fraud. And stringing the process out allows them to mobilize for their end game.
Yeah, so let's talk about that end game, right? Because after all the bogus lawsuits are finished, what's left are what you and I call the point-shaving lawsuits. And here's how these set up the potential for the Supreme Court to give us deja vu all over again.
Oh, my God.
Let's set the stage here. Not 13th century Saxony, but we're going to time travel back to election night, November 7th, 2000. The Democratic candidate for president, Al Gore, has won 20 states and the District of Columbia, totaling 267 electoral votes. He also won 51 million popular votes. Meanwhile, his opponent, Texas Governor George W. Bush, has won 29 smaller states, totaling just 246 electoral votes, and he has earned just under 50.5 million popular votes. So Gore leads in the Electoral College, and he leads in the popular vote. You may note 20 plus 29 leaves one state undecided. That was the state of Florida. So the day after Election Day, the Florida Division of Elections, which reported to Republican Katherine Harris, Secretary of State, who in turn reported to George W. Bush's brother, then Governor Jeb Bush, reported a lead for Bush of 1,784 votes out of nearly 6 million votes cast statewide.
And that triggered a statutorily mandated machine recount pursuant to Florida Statute 102 141, Section 7, which kicks in when the margin is 0.5% or less. Bush's margin was 1/100%, which is substantially less. That was the scene of the infamous Brooks Brothers riot, where a bunch of white Republican dudes descended on Miami-Dade and tried to intimidate local election officials into stopping the recount with their, sheer pasty effrontery. That failed, although loads of them went on to have important careers in Republican politics. Anyway, put a pin in this because it's really, really important that the recount was done by optic scanners in 2000. That's how they completed it in 2 days. Because if you have to do a hand recount, as we know from the Arizona, hand recount of Maricopa County, it'll take like 6 months. Anyway, after the machine recount, Bush's lead dropped to just 537 votes. And as you might imagine, there are a bunch of lawsuits over a bunch of issues.
Yeah, and before we talk about the relief that the Florida Supreme Court did in fact order in 2000, let's rabbit trail again on what they didn't first, right? Because one of the most dramatic but least legally significant was the insane butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County that made it look like the way to vote for Al Gore was to punch this hole in the middle of the ballot. And it turned out that the machine would actually then read that as a vote for third-party candidate Pat Buchanan.
The flashbacks, man. All right. So a 2001 peer-reviewed article in the American Political Science Review showed that of the 3,053 counties where Buchanan was on the ballot, he received the greatest number of anomalous excess votes in Palm Beach County. Palm Beach County is home to one of the largest Jewish populations in the United States. There are over 200,000 Jews who live there. 2 of those people were in 2000 my wonderful grandparents, who were pretty sure that they voted for Pat Buchanan by accident. Obviously, they would not have voted for that filthy anti-Semite on purpose, and neither would their friends at the non-restricted golf club in Boynton Beach. The article estimated that at least 2,000 Democratic ballots in Palm Beach County were mistakenly punched for Pat Buchanan, that those people intended to vote for Al Gore, and had they actually voted for Al Gore, that would have changed the outcome of the election. So thanks, Bubby and Zadie.
Right. But the courts couldn't award relief based on the theory of, no, come on, Mrs. Pomerantz really didn't vote for Pat Buchanan, right?
She didn't mean to.
Yeah, I know. Nor could the courts award relief for what were called overvotes. And overvotes happen when you have more than one candidate for president selected on a ballot. And so the machine just says, oh yeah, you voted for more than one candidate, it invalidates your vote for that office and moves on. And let's unpack that one a little bit, because as with the butterfly ballot, there's an intuitive explanation here. Let's say you have a hand-marked ballot that votes for Republican candidates in every other race. And then for president, there's an oval that's filled out for Bush, but it's, got some stray marks, and the stray pencil marks just happen to touch the Gore circle. And Liz, as you emphasized, this was a machine recount, right? So in some cases, the machine reads that as the person voting for both Bush and Gore, right? And therefore as an overvote, so it throws it all out and says no vote for president. But if a human being looks at that ballot, you go, oh yeah, this is very clearly a vote for Bush, right? Like it's just a stray pencil mark that got it invalidated. Or as was more likely if the situation were reversed, right? You have Democrats up and down the ballot, you have a clearly filled out mark for Gore, and you have some stray pencil mark or something that also ticks the Bush box. And a person could look at it and say, okay, that's a Gore vote. Let's count that as a Gore vote. And the Gore campaign asked for that, right? They asked for a hand recount of all the overvotes to correct for those obvious machine deficiencies. And the Florida Supreme Court said no. Right. And again, I'm not sure they're wrong about this, right? As with the butterfly arguments, the court's reasoning was, look, we agree with you. We think it's pretty likely that voters casting these ballots probably really meant to vote for, Bush or Gore, whoever had the circle filled out. But we as the court are not going to second guess what they actually did, right? Because that just requires us to speculate. So sorry, you get no relief. And again, can't say that that's wrong.
Right.
But I went down this rabbit trail for 2 reasons. First, because if you're trying to figure out in a metaphysical sense, like who the voting citizens of Florida actually wanted to be president in 2000, the answer is pretty clearly Al Gore, right? There's not an argument to be made to the contrary. And second, because the truly cockamamie things that, Trump and the Kraken lawsuits wanted in 2020 based on statistical analyses and Terpsichore saying they were all much crazier than just counting overvotes. And the courts were like, no, we're not doing statistical analysis recalibration back in 2000.
Right. I mean, Rudy Giuliani is no longer welcome to practice law in any state because the only case in which he entered his appearance was in Pennsylvania. And what he asked the court for was for the court to apply a statistical haircut to the mail-in ballots in Philadelphia based on his theory that they were fraudulent and, so that there should be a mathematical adjustment. That's nuts.
Yeah. So, okay. If the Palm Beach butterfly ballots are out and the overvotes are out, here's the relief that the Florida Supreme Court did order, and it had to do with undervotes. And an undervote is when the ballot has votes for all of the down ballot races, but no recorded vote for president, right? So you can pull them out by the machine sorting, right? And sometimes there are undervotes for deliberate reasons, right? Like, I imagine a bunch of Republicans in Maryland will probably vote for Larry Hogan for Senate and Republicans in their local races, but leave the presidential line blank. Okay, right? That happens.
Yeah. I mean, Larry Hogan, for one, has said that's more or less what he intends to do.
An excellent point. So, okay, but undervotes, in addition to being a deliberate expression of preference, also happen when the machine recount can't process the voter's clear intention to vote for a presidential candidate. So there were two principal ways that this happened in Florida in 2000. So one, on hand ballots, is if the circle was incorrectly filled out, like you didn't use the number 2 pencil, and some people, instead of bubbling in the oval, put like a check mark or an X or,
Sharpie gate.
Right. But if a human, so to the machines, to, particularly the 2000 machines, it processes it as no vote. But if a human looks at it, they're like, oh yeah, this person tried to vote for Bush or Gore, but our, Packard Bell 5 dots per inch optical scanner couldn't read it. So now we're going to go back and now we're going to count that vote.
Right. And the second issue with the punch ballots was the so-called hanging chads, right? So you pushed a little button and it pushed a little plunger, which perforated the paper and pushed out the little tab, but the tab didn't fully detach. The tab was the chad. And when it goes through the machine, it reads as no vote because there's still a little piece of paper there. On December 8th, 2000, the Florida Supreme Court ordered the hand recount of some 61,000 ballots with undervotes for president to begin immediately. 9,000 of those were in Dade County, and at the time, and subsequently confirmed, it was pretty clear that this would provide enough votes to Gore to make up the 537 vote margin. Mm-hmm. So the next day, the Bush campaign raced to the Supreme Court and got an injunction stopping the recount. So remember, think of the dates here. That's December 8th, right? So 2 days later, the Supreme Court hears oral argument. And the day after that, December 12th, the court hands down Bush v. Gore, which was a 5-4 opinion, split along party lines, with the 5 conservatives, including Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, voting to permanently stop the count. And the 4 liberals were incredulous in their dissent, and they called the majority's reasoning not serious.
Yeah, and it was not, right? Because, as you point out on the timeline, Liz, having stopped the recounts on December 8th, the Supreme Court lamented that Florida could not complete those recounts by the safe harbor deadline in the Electoral Count Act of December 12th, which, A, they might have had you not stopped the recounts, and B, more importantly, from a legal perspective, missing a safe harbor deadline means that you as a state have missed out on a benefit, right, of having it presumptively be valid, but not that you failed to comply with federal law, right? The state could decide to miss it if they needed to, which this is a pretty good reason to miss it.
Yeah, that was a terrible time. I distinctly remember voting on those punch card machines in 2002 and 2004 and just like stabbing the button with my finger because we were all so pissed and we were terrified that our votes would not fully dislodge that chad and then they wouldn't be counted.
Yeah, I can't believe we did election ballots the same way they do all-star ballots at the ballpark. But okay, Liz, why don't you take it and put this all together? Because this is really the thesis that you came up with, and I think it's a good one.
All right, thanks. But before we do that, we're going to take a little ad break. Unless you're a subscriber at patreon.com/lawandchaospod or at lawandchaospod.com. Be right back, guys. Okay, so here are the conditions for pulling a 2024 Bush v. Gore. Trump has to be ahead by some very tiny margin in a state or states that would tip the Electoral College. And there has to be a readily segregated, uncounted pool of ballots that could erase that red mirage in the same way that there was, in Miami-Dade. Those could be military and citizens abroad ballots, the UOCAVA ballots. We've talked about them a bunch here. They could be provisional ballots from heavily Democratic precincts. They could be ballots rejected for signature mismatches that need to be reviewed. It could be some other technical defect, right? There just has to be a pile of them, right? Republicans are then going to descend on that state and try to pick off Harris ballots one by one, or, better for them, in groups if they can, right? Mm-hmm. Because as we've said, some pools of ballots that you're going to know that they're heavily Democratic, either by geography or because they're more Democratic mail-in ballots, whatever. So, for example, Georgia passed a law allowing any citizen to challenge the eligibility of any other voter. So there are like 65,000 pending vote challenges claiming that voters on the rolls in Georgia have moved away or died, they're felons, they're non-citizens, whatever. And look, as an aside, these people have not been subtle. They are challenging people based on their last names, mostly because they have Hispanic last names. And Hispanic voters, despite the fact that Trump has made inroads, are still voting something like 70% for Democrats. So if you challenge a Hispanic voter, you have like a 70% likelihood of knocking out a Harris vote. Okay. Mm-hmm. So some counties have let these challenge voters cast normal ballots when they show up at the polls. Some have forced them to cast a provisional ballot. So if we get to a place where the total number of provisional voters makes up the margin between Trump and Harris, you can bet your ass that the RNC will be trying to get each and every one of those provisional ballots knocked off the rolls and deemed ineligible.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize your point about provisional ballots, because the more you and I talked about this, the more we came to see that as the real vulnerability in the system in 2024. So provisional ballots were created by the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, in 2002, in large part due to complaints about the way the 2000 election was handled. And in particular, Democrats in Florida and elsewhere argued that local election officials were turning them away from the polls on election day, even though they were valid registered voters. So what HAVA did, in part, was create 52 U.S.C. Section 21082, which provides for the provisional ballot. And here's how that works. If you, as a voter, show up at a polling place and you're not on the official list of eligible voters that was circulated to the election officials there, instead of just telling you to go away, the election official is required by law to give you a provisional ballot. And then you, as the voter, must sign an affidavit that says you are eligible by law to vote in that jurisdiction and you're registered to vote. And then HAVA directed states to come up with their own mechanism to check to see if somebody who casts a provisional ballot in that way also voted elsewhere, right? So here's how the fraud could happen, right? Not that there's much of an example of this, but if I vote in my actual precinct where I'm on the voting rolls, and then I drive to a different one, they'll give me a provisional ballot and they'll let me cast it. But then the state will hold each of those provisional ballots until after all the rest of the votes are cast and counted. And then they'll check to see if I voted previously. And if I have, then they throw the provisional ballot away, right? And if I haven't, then it counts. So that's how the system works.
Yeah, if you prove that you are who you are, right?
Right.
Okay, so here's the important part. Provisional ballots are both segregated and counted last. That's after in person, that's after vote by mail. So before a state starts counting this relatively tiny pool of votes, everybody knows exactly how many votes it will take for the party that's behind to overtake the party that's ahead. Mm-hmm. So you can certainly see how the RNC appealing to a federal court and trying to get all of those provisional ballots thrown out if they think it would constitute the margin of victory is a pretty, appealing path for them. That is the Bush v. Gore scenario, because if it comes down to provisional ballots, it's going to be trench warfare to try and either disqualify Harris votes or stop the count with Trump ahead. And I don't think that these people are going to be doing a Brooks Brothers style riot this time around. So the campaign has every incentive to race to the Supreme Court and demand an injunction preventing that state or states from counting these provisional ballots. That would lock in a Trump win, even though if you followed the law, it would be a loss because you'd count all the votes. And look, we just talked about one of these efforts in our most recent Law and Chaos written post, right? So in Pennsylvania, your mail-in ballot has to be put into an envelope, and the envelope has another security envelope, et cetera, et cetera. And that's pretty counterintuitive. Lots of people forget to put the security envelope in there or screw it up some other way. They don't put the signature on, et cetera. Under the existing rules, the registrar can't open it and check whether you screwed it up. But they can usually tell if you haven't put the inner security envelope in there. And so the registrar will probably, depending on the county, send a notice to any voter who screws up the mail-in ballot in that way. And it says, hey, you screwed this up. If there isn't time to mail a new one, show up at your local polling station and cast a provisional ballot instead. And in fact, sometimes they are allowed to start processing those ballots the morning of, and the system will automatically, in some jurisdictions, send you an email that says your ballot was defective. You can go and cast a provisional ballot in person if you would like your vote to count. Republicans have challenged that. They want the state to simply throw away defective mail-in ballots and disallow any provisional ballot that a voter would cast. Their theory is that the voter already cast a ballot by mail, even though it was rejected for being defective and thrown in the trash. So they say you shouldn't be allowed to vote provisionally if you screw up your original ballot. And the trial court said, yeah, okay, fine. Cast is cast. And even though your ballot was never cast, we're going to say it's close enough. Pennsylvania Supreme Court, though, in a 4-3 decision a couple of days ago said, no, a defective ballot that gets discarded was never cast. And so, of course, these people get to exercise their franchise and can cast a provisional ballot. That is the whole point of HAVA, right? If you haven't cast a vote, then you can cast your provisional ballot and it'll count. And actually, the minority dissent in that case threw up a big old flag having to do with the independent state legislature theory, basically inviting the Supreme Court to jump in here. We'll talk about that in a minute. We think it's mostly bogus for reasons we'll get into in the subscriber bonus. But like in the Georgia example, you can see how this Pennsylvania lawsuit is going to lead to a pile of provisional ballots, which Trump will definitely challenge if it has a chance of putting him over the top in Pennsylvania. Maybe he'll challenge it based, as we said, on the independent state legislature theory. That is that basically TLDR, courts aren't allowed, they say, to challenge the way that the legislature wants to run elections. Maybe Trump is going to challenge it based on some other legal fig leaf in hopes that the Supreme Court will jump in and save him. They did it 24 years ago for George Bush based on even flimsier pretext. And it sucks a lot. And the only way to be sure that it doesn't happen is for Harris to get outside the margin on these provisional ballots. Like, they're going to challenge it 6 ways from Sunday. But if the provisional ballots are the way that the Supreme Court can steal it, we got to get her outside the margin. And I mean, look, we're back again to where we started, which is with Bill Barr, right? We have to make it too hard to steal, because if it's possible, they will.
Yeah. Okay, so that is going to do it for today's show, unless you're a subscriber at any level, at which point you'll get the Patreon bonus on the truly terrifying scenario that keeps me up at night. And but stick around for that.
All right, thank you guys, and keep the faith. Have a lovely weekend. It's just breathe.
Law and Chaos Podcast is a production of Raise Ups and Media, LLC, is intended solely as entertainment, does not constitute legal advice, and does not form an attorney-client relationship. This show is researched and written by Liz Dye and produced by Bryce Blankenagel. Law and Chaos Pod, copyright 2024, Raise Ups and Media, LLC, all rights reserved.